everybody. Good news, finally able to get the notes uploaded. Go to YouTube, type in APWH 33.1 to get to the first, point 2 to get to the second, and then 33.3 to get to the third. Or if you want to type in Derek Albright, that should get you there too. I'll be putting in links as well. So any avenue you want to get to the notes. Unfortunately, that was the only way I could do it. I tried Google Classroom, tried uploading it to the website, and the file was just too big. So hopefully this will be the consistent avenue that we will have. I'm going to extend the test. It'll still be up at Friday at 4 o'clock, but it will continue till Monday at 11:59 because I want to give you that extension since I got the notes up so late. But I shouldn't have that problem going forward for next week. Don't forget your daily attendance. And don't forget your vocab due today, Friday. Don't forget your outline on Saturday. And like I said, that test will be extended. And of course, any questions, please let me know. All right, so let's pick up where we left off with the war plans. Now, the French are going to have Plan 17, which is going to heavily emphasize their rapid offensive. Like we talked about a little bit last time, they are going to look to try to knock out and invade Belgium and then go through and try to get France and knock them out before Russia can mobilize. Now, this will play a part in when the war actually starts in mobilization of resources and humans for battle and then capital as well. So there's going to be a lot of moving parts with this. And this all goes back to what we talked about last time with the fear of encirclement that Germany has. Now, the French, they want to be defeated swiftly, as far as the Germans would like to knock out the French swiftly. And then, like we said, turn their attention to Russia, because if Russia does mobilize, it's probably going to take them a little while to get their munitions, to get their soldiers, and to get their resources mobilized and to get it put in position. And what this is going to do is cause this inflexibility of these war plans so that these timetables are going to have to be carried out. And we'll have to have heavy emphasis on if this happens, then we have to continue on this course of action. So it's very inflexible when you're looking at these maneuvers, and especially with the French plan, it's just heavy emphasis on just attack in these rapid offenses that we just stated. So those are the plans, example of a couple of the plans that will be in motion if things happen. Now, when we look at the declarations of war, what we're going to see is that this assassination is going to spark off this domino effect like we talked about for these mobilizations of war. We get July 23rd. The Austrians will issue this ultimatum to the Serbs. And then July 28th, we will get the Austrians that will declare war. And then on July 29, we will have the Russians that will mobilize to defend Serbia. And then July 31st, the Germans will issue ultimatums to Russia and France. And so, again, this tumbling. And basically, the declarations that were met, I mean, there was a lot of ultimatums that were given as far as what they wanted. And the Serbian government will accept most of the terms of from the ultimatum of the Austro-Hungarians, except for one, which the problem is going to be on sovereignty. So they want to take part in any Serbian investigation of persons that are found on the Serbian territory, connected to the assassination of France Ferdinand and the Archduke. Now, on the July 28th, after declaring the Serbian reply to be unsatisfactory, we'll have the Austro-Hungarians declare war on Serbia, and then the war kind of officially has begun regionally at least. Now, on July 29th, the Russian government will mobilize its troops and try to defend its Serbian ally, because it kind of has to, and then defend itself from Austria as well. We'll get the Tsar of Russia at the time, Nicholas II, who will try to take a decisive step, and reluctantly, and only after its military experts will try to convince him that a partial mobilization against the Austrians would upset this plan that they have and timetables that they have. But also delayed mobilization might invite this defeat overall against the Russians. And so the problem is offsetting the plans in motion. Now, on the 31st of July, we will have demanding that the Russian army cease. German ultimatum demanding that the Russian army ceases its mobilization immediately, and then another ultimatum addressing that the French will demand to know what the French intentions were in case Germany and Russia end up going to war. So the Russians will reply with a blunt word of impossible, and the French will never answer. So on August 1st, we have the German government that will declare war on Russia, and the French will start to mobilize. Now, after waiting 2 more days, the Germans declare war on France on August 3rd, and then on the same day, the German troops will invade Belgium as their Schlieffen plan will mention. And then the key to this plan was just to attack the left flank of the French army by this massive German force through Belgium, even though the Belgians will try to be neutral in this, and they will try to go back to, or try to get the British to try to help them out to get the Germans out of Belgium through this swift invasion. Now, this will be very, very quick as it is going forward, but let's look at this real quick. This is a French propaganda poster that we see. It says the heroes of Belgium in 1914, but this just shows the expression of outrage at the German invasion of Belgium, but also the bruteness that they try to portray, or subhuman almost, that they try to portray the Germans as well. Again, kind of going to this, making them almost feel like they are not human. Now, when we look at the war of attrition, what we see is mostly stalemates. In the West, we get 3 years of a stalemate. We get a trench from the English Channel to Switzerland, and there's no man's land in between. There's craters. There's heavy fire. There's machine guns. Nobody wants to budge in a sense, and they're entrenched. Trench warfare was horrible, especially for those in the trenches. You had constant flooding. You had mud. People getting amputated from loss of toes and feet. You had lice rampant. You had rodents that were eating the corpses everywhere. I mean, it was just a horrible way to start this war. But a lot of the military tech that we'll talk about is going to be mostly for defenses. And so we have to kind of rethink how these weapons are going to be used going forward, especially with using them in an offensive light. So this war of attrition, we have basically a stalemate in the West. Now, in the East, we have a little bit more movement, and because of what's happening in Russia, which we won't really go into that right now, in the East, we get the Treaty of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty in March of 1918, which will place the Central Powers in control of parts of that that Eastern Front, and then the Russians will have to actually go kind of handle business at home, which we will get to here in a little bit. Now, when we look at the new weapons as far as the defense that we talked about, some of these new weapons are kind of what's been stated already. Barbed wire, which has been used a lot in the United States and other places for cattle and in animals in general, is going to be used throughout trench warfare to try to stop soldiers from advancing. But also the biggest one probably being the machine gun, with how fast and rapid these bullets can come out, be reloaded. And so it's going to be a spray and pray, and just to keep the trenches where they are and create this sense of no man's land where nobody would cross, because it would be a suicide mission, especially when you have these machine guns being posted all over the place and being used very, very effectively. But one of the ones that will be feared the most is going to be mustard gas. And what it's going to do is it's going to have to be a yellow gas, which is why it gets its name. And the effects of mustard gas is why it was so feared is it didn't really show up for about 12 hours after exposure, but then it kind of rots the body from the inside out, and it blisters the skin and damages the eyes, and then the gas will attack the bronchial tubes, strip off the mucous membrane, and then death would occur in between 4 to 5 weeks, but be a very painful, excruciating death, and that's why they feared it so much. So that's going to be used, and even though a lot of these weapons are going to be used defensively, we're not going to see anything offensively that will kind of break the mold that we see. Tanks will be one of those that they can go over barbed wire, maybe cross no man's land, take down shrubs, take down vegetation. And initially it is effective, but it gets ground to a halt very quickly, because it's just not the technology's not there. It's just not, it hasn't been utilized enough. Airplanes to a degree as well. We won't really see the tank in the airplane be used as effectively until we get to World War II. Now, airplanes will have limited bombing and strafing of shooting, more usually for aerial reconnaissance and kind of mapping out where the enemies are or where supplies are, and so on. So we will have some reconnaissance that will be used here as well. Now, we do get some dogfights out of this to try to stop the reconnaissance, and that's where we kind of get these aces and the dogfights where they get publicized and kind of glorified from this, which will become a lot more intense going into World War II. But also submarines will be used by both, trying to cut off and blockade from food and supplies getting to host countries, but also to using it as an effective style to try kind of patrol the waters and keep people off the coastlines where they don't need to be. Now, here's a picture of a Belgian machine gun and being carried and carted by dogs. And this machine gun is most likely going to the front in Belgium, but you can see the dogs muzzled. You can see the machine gun on the back as it is being carried, and highly effective for this war. Now, what we see in this painting, we can see that this is an air raid warden in a helmet and gas mask, and he's holding a wooden gas attack rattle, which they will spin around to kind of signal that there is a gas attack imminent or is happening. But we see that this is a horrible dimension that has really tipped the scales as far as casualties go in the war. And that's kind of what the big issue is going forward, is casualties going forward from these industrialized countries pumping out all these munitions and guns and planes. And we'll talk about the home front here very quickly. And then here is a dogfight that you can see between a German and British plane during the Great War. And this will be a new style of combat that we've never seen before. And planes being in their infancy, kind of like the tank and submarine, will obviously get usefulness in World War II as technology develops. And just to kind of show you, here's a map of the war at this time. You can see the Triple Entente there. You can see the allies of the Triple Entente as well, the Central Powers there in the green, and then neutral nations with the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, and Spain at this time. You can kind of see the movements going there in the red line through France that kind of signifies the no man's land, but also the farthest advance of the allies or Central Powers, but also the east there as well going into Russia. You can see the treaty line as well, and then the maximum German advance all the way up until 1918. And you can see the Ottoman Empire, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well in the green. Now, let's look at bloodletting of the new warfare. And you can see we've been kind of talking about this for a little bit in this chapter as far as death totals and casualties in general. So in this bloodletting, we're going to have a whole new meaning to what it is as far as death goes. So the first thing, this unprecedented casualties. Let's talk about the in 1916, the Germans that will try to break the deadlock with this huge assault on the fortress of Verdun. And the French rallying cry will be, "They shall not pass." Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? And they did not. But we see, obviously, this is going to be at a tremendous cost. You can see 315,000 French will be killed, 280,000 German casualties, and fewer than 160,000 bodies to be recovered because they are being sucked down into the mud. There's only body parts. They've been blown apart. I mean, this is a very, very, very high casualty offensive that didn't really get much. I mean, what we see is that to relieve some of the pressure on Verdun, British forces will actually try a counterattack somewhere else at Somme, and by November, they only gain a few thousand yards at the cost of 420,000 casualties, and the Germans will suffer similar losses, although in the end, neither side really gained any strategic advantage from doing these onslaughts. And so this, again, goes to seeing the lack of just defensive, and no real clear-cut advantage for either person in this war. So this bloodletting that we will see will come across a lot going forward, and especially on these kind of, we got to do something, we got to break the stalemate in some nations going for broke on certain offenses. So this will take us to a whole new warfare. Now, let's kind of get to the home front in total war. This is the idea that we first now have this word usage of total war and the home front. Now, normally it was just armies that were being sought after and kind of breaking the will of the army and the government to end some type of war. Well, now what we're having is the home front, in a sense that you have the war front and the home front. Now, because societies are industrialized, they have to mobilize. And because they are mobilizing, now you have to defeat the civilians, basically, to be able to have total success in the war front as opposed to the home front. So we'll start to see resources be diverted and now civilians being targeted as opposed to just the armies because of the industrialization, but also the production that these civilians are doing. So we can see the implications of modern industrial war and this concept of a home front from this. Even in democratic societies and governments, we will see governments take command of economies because resources have to be distributed and have to be distributed to the war front and for mobilization and resources and munitions as well. So we'll see the governments take command of these economies. But what it will do, just like in the war in World War I and World War II, is we'll see women start to mobilize into the workforce as men start to be conscripted, as forced from their homes and drafted. At first, this wasn't such a thing. And like we talked about, this war was pretty much glorified at first. I mean, a lot of people were happy to go to war, that it was going to be quick, fast, easy, and kind of be, lack of a better word, just glorified as heroes when they come home. But this is going to end very, very quickly as far as how fast this thing ends, but also the glory that they think they can have coming back. Now, the men will leave and the women will come out and fulfill those jobs. So we see women start to go into the workforce, and women want to do this to kind of show their worth, that they can do the things that men do. But also, too, there's that nationalism of pride as well, that they are doing their part for the war as well. Now, probably one of the most crucial work performed by women during the war was the making of shells. Several million women and sometimes children are going to put in the long hours in these munitions factories, and this work will expose them to severe dangers. I mean, obviously with explosives, you want to try to keep any sparks away as possible, but we will see deaths in these factories and explosions in these factories because you're working with volatile products. I mean, it's only kind of it's going to happen at some point. But also, too, TNT will come about, and a lot of women will get TNT poisoning, and symptoms of that will be yellow skin, orange hair, and really the only effective remedy for this is going to be good rest, good food, and plenty of fresh milk. Well, most women wouldn't be able to get that because they're being pushed to work and work and work and work. But also, too, we get the advent of attacking the home front. You see here bombing of civilians in areas by Zeppelins where they will be dropping bombs. Now, these Zeppelins won't be that successful. One of the attempts they talk about in the book will only be about one casualty. And because of that one casualty, they're not going to be as effective. So that will be pushed back a little bit. But it gives the advent of the idea of going after civilian populations. We obviously see this a lot more in World War II, and especially with the build-up to the end of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So that's a little bit different reason, but you get the idea of the home front being kind of the catalyst of now going into the crosshairs as far as war goes. Now, with propaganda, we're going to see the maintenance of public support for war. We'll even see some people be tried and thrown in jail because of what they are spouting off as propaganda. And most of this will be trying to hide the war effort as far as casualties, deaths, losses as well. And they're going to really pump out the wins here as well as, or at least moral wins that they will have. But we even have an example in France. The former Prime Minister Joseph Quilou will spend 2 years in prison awaiting trial because he was publicly suggested that in the French best interest that they should reach a compromise and reach a peace with Germany, which even for that, from a former prime minister, that just goes to show you that they were controlling the narrative very, very tightly to make sure that there was no treasonous or traitorous ideas going on, and especially propaganda, because a lot of untruths are being told, and they want to make sure that morale stays up, but also, too, again, control the narrative. Now, the irony is this disbelief regarding World War I propaganda and the belief in World War II atrocities are more difficult. So because of the rampantness of publishing and the cheap ineffectiveness of headlines, tabloids, and so on, this is where we're going to get a lot of this, but also to pump up the fear of what we see with against these other groups. We have the enemy posters and pamphlets, and people try to prove scientific studies depicting that the enemy is subhuman savages, like we saw earlier with the Belgium poster, while German propaganda will depict Russians as semi-Asiatic barbarians. The French authorities will chronicle the atrocities committed by the German, quote, Hun in Belgium that we saw. In 1917, the Times of London will publish a story claiming that Germans converted human corpses into fertilizer and food, but then come to find out that they actually translated it wrong. In the German word for horse had been mistakenly translated as human. So even then being pumped out. And then we also see the Germans doing their own thing. One widely distributed poster invoked images of a African-American Allied soldier that was raping German women, including pregnant women, to suggest the horrors that would follow if the nation's war effort failed. And that's kind of what was always being pumped out was, here's what's going to happen to you if we fail, if we fail, if we fail. And so stoking the fear of those on the home front if they end up failing. Now, lastly, let's end it with this. Global involvement. Because of all the colonialism and imperialism that we saw in the late 1800s, this is gonna allow World War I to continue in the fashion that it is, with all these casualties and everything else. So we get the importation of troops from colonies in the United Kingdom, like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and this will be big as far as who they're bringing in, because Gallipoli in the peninsula there by the Dardanelles and by Constantinople, they're going to try to attack the Ottomans and try to make sure that they can kind of wither them away slowly but surely. But the Australians, New Zealanders, and the Canadians are going to be the big brute force of these that make it into these invasions. And so it's not really so much the British, but pulling on a lot of these places to try to give resources, people, munitions, whatever they can organize to keep up, because the war is eating up all of this. It's eating up the resources. It's eating up the human or the soldiers. It's eating up all of this, and so these colonies are kind of at the whim of their imperial powers as far as gaining as much population and raw resources as possible. Now, what Japan is going to do is Japan is going to look at this as an opportunity to go at China. So it's going to look at China with the distraction of European powers, and it's going to try to issue these 21 demands. And some of these 21 demands are this, and you can see why this ultimatum was only accepted somewhat. But if it was accepted, they would have reduced China to a protectorate of Japan. The most important demands were that the Chinese confirm the Japanese seizure of Shandong from Germany, grant Japanese industrial monopolies in central China, place Japanese overseers in key government positions, give Japan joint control of Chinese police forces, restrict their arms purchases to Japanese manufacturers, and make those purchases only with the approval of the Tokyo government. Now, like we said, China's going to submit to most of those demands but reject others, and they're going to kind of sneak this off to the British. And so the British will kind of take note of this and will speak up for China in this. But if you're Japan, the Allies were okay with, the Triple Entente was okay with helping them out with getting or stripping Germany of its colonial holdings in Africa and in Southeast Asia, East Asia as well. And so kind of hitting them in the colonial sense that they can't utilize those like the Triple Entente will try to do. We also see the Armenian massacres in this time period, this major non-Muslim ethnic group of the Christian Armenians that will be pushed out by the Turks, and this will be known as the Armenian massacre. And the government will try to say that this had nothing, they'll deny this and try to act like nothing happened. But we see that there will be a lot of deaths with Armenians and in the millions. And this will be an issue going forward, especially when everything settles. So these wartime atrocities that took place principally between 1915 and 17 have become known as what we said, the Armenian genocide. But best estimates suggest that maybe close to 1 million Armenians perished, probably more. Although it's generally agreed that the Armenian genocide did not occur, the Turkish government in particular rejects the label of genocide and claims that the Armenian deaths resulted from a state-sponsored plan of mass extermination, but from communal warfare perpetuated by Christians and Muslims, disease and famine as a way to undermine the government, which we know is not true. But the Ottoman Empire what we're going to see with the ascent of Russia will be forced or forge a secret agreement, the Sykes-Picot Treaty of 1916, which will define their future spheres of influence and control in Southwest Asia. So once the Ottomans fall, the British and French are gonna look at this as again more imperial opportunities as they try to as the British and French kind of insurrect these Arab rebellions and kind of push to bring down the Ottomans, and this will be pushed forward as well with the narrative. So we've kind of gone through what's going on at the start of the war from the first part when we started with Princeps Bullet and kind of went back and looked at what the British advances were, what the French advances were, the casualties, the home front, and kind of put this all together as far as World War I goes. Now, when we come back next time and finish this for the third part, we're going to look at the end of the war. We'll look at revolution in Russia. Then we'll move over to U.S. intervention and the collapse of the Central Powers. Look at what happens after the war, and then challenges to European preeminence. And that's basically where we'll send it off. All right. Take care.